Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Angela Caicedo, and with me I have Simon Ritter. We are actually Java evangelists at Oracle, and it's a great pleasure to be here today. So Extreme GUI Makeover. So I think this is kind of a legendary talk at Java 1. It's been very popular in the past, and I'm trying to do something a little bit different. Not because the previous one were popular enough, but because a lot of the things were already done. I wanted to do something different. So normally in the past, what happened is the speaker just take an application, an UI, and just turn that UI into something more beautiful, right? Using JavaFX, something really stunning. I wanted to create a stunning applications from the scratch, show you something. Okay, if I really want to take advantage of JavaFX, what are the components I want to bring into my UI to really make stylish, great-looking UI? So what I'm trying to bring here is something a little bit different, and I hope you enjoy it. So what I'm going to do, to begin with, I'm going to start with the demos. I want to show you what are we going to be using for the talk. Hope you don't leave after seeing the demos, but I hope you stay for all of it. Basically, the two main points for creating these user interfaces will be styling them, and we're going to use CSS. So we're going to talk like the basic stuff, the most important stuff for CSS, how you can create a skin for your UI and make it look really impressive. And then the second one, I really think that given the power of JavaFX animations, how you can use that into your UI design, how you can really have your components dropping or having your screen moving around a little bit. So think about a little bit of unconventional UIs and looking into, okay, how can I bring effect? How can I bring animation? And if I have conventional components, how do I make it look great using CSS? So that's pretty much a little bit of the talk. The two demos that I'm going to present were actually built by me. And I actually ended up having two approaches. And I think I found it that, I've been talking to the colleagues, okay, which one should I go for? And I really see that both approaches are actually useful for different scenarios. So I actually wanted at the end to show you, okay, so this is what happened at the end. You can either do that or do this, and these are the reasons behind that. So it's a little bit from my experience, what do I think you can actually do? Tools, if you think about it, for JavaFX, we have the scene builder, the JavaFX scene builder. And I have to say, I'm an evangelist, but I'm a developer. So as you see, all the demos that I present are built by me, not by anybody else. So if there's any critics, welcome. I'm the only one to blame. But what I really want to share with you guys, the tools are being really, really important in the creation of this. It's like, it will take me 100 times longer to create the UIs if I didn't have the scene builder. So I really think there is a really powerful combination between NetBeans and scene builder to create this type of UI, and I think it will save you a lot of time. Okay, so the first demo is the City Explorer. So you can see that I didn't want to use a conventional menu item. If you want to know how to customize the menus, you can go to last year's talk or the previous year talk, and you can definitely find something like that. So what I wanted to do is a non-conventional. I think, from my point of view, is very easy to navigate. Even though there is no conventional, you can feel like, okay, there is Explorer, there are places to go, there is weather, and also cities to change. So even though it's simplified, it's modern, it is actually intuitive. Somebody that hasn't used it knows how to navigate. For this one, pretty much the whole screen, the whole application is loaded in the background. It's a big image, and I just have a viewport, and I just navigate through it. And we will see more details about that. A lot of animations, so changing from one screen to another, I'm going to do an animation, things like that. And I really think that technologies come along together, and so this is not the case of just using JavaFX. So for example, for places, we're going to see how HTML5 and JavaScript got to play in this application. So these are the different screens. Once you go to individual screens, you can really see CSS styling the components. So we're going to see how you can actually change the components, the shape of it, the coloring, stuff like that. So you can see it in the combo box. For the map itself, so that's what we use in HTML5 and JavaScript. So that's pretty much the components. Transparency, so I think there is something really powerful. We have effects on JavaFX, so we can see that we have reflection for the maps, we have transparency for the components, and all that is given. And again, setting those on Scene Builder is just a matter of clicking something or changing the opacity in one slide bar on the Scene Builder. So there's not much programming really to do. Actually, to be honest with you, when building a demo like this, 90% of the time is coming up with the graphics. 10% is really putting things together with the tools, but it's more time-consuming, the graphics. The second demo, we wanted to do a casino application. And the reason for this demo is we wanted to have gesture recognition. So instead of using conventional mouse, I have my friend, Simon Reeder, who always think about crazy stuff. And there's a session at 3 o'clock that actually take you into details about how he built the interface, so you can actually do gestures, use gestures to move around the application. So just a main menu at the bottom, that's the only one we use, otherwise everything it will be with gestures. The menu are not visible, they are slide-in menus, so I think this is very convenient even from the bottom or from the side, where you can hide it, so just slide in the menus rather than having them all the time there. Semi-transparent bars, so transparency again, really powerful for me. There's animations going on, so you don't want to miss that, so by bringing in a transparent bar, I think you still appreciate the background while you are selecting your options. Customized buttons, so you can actually create your own buttons. Again, reflection is given. You can actually have zoom in as you approach with the mouse, push effect when you select something, so it is actually nice. Human interaction, as I say, we have gesture recognition using the Wii Remote, and we have Neuroski, that is kind of a mind reader. So again, that part will be in our next talk at 3 o'clock. These are the screens that were created for the casino application. Pretty much the first one has the menu, only left and right. The other screens do not have a menu. We have the blackjack with actually a lot of animations going on. Just way too many animations. We're gonna see how JavaFX was very, very handy in terms of how do I play animation sequentially. If I'm getting the cards to the player, okay, once I finish one card, let's go to the next one. It's a lot of animations going on really nicely. But if you need it, originally I wanted to do more conventional UIs, like the one you saw for the roulette. So you can see that you can actually mix and match nice animation UI with a more, common UI, like the user, type in the user information or how much you want to bet in the game, etc. So at the end, I ended up removing that part because we wanted to go with gestures. We didn't want to type or anything like that. But that's kind of the demos. So let me show them actually in real time. Okay, good. Good start. Good way to start the presentation. Nothing crashes. I do have a backup plan. If my machine just refuses to work, we still have Simon's. So.
Please don't say that.
So this is the first one. So again, very intuitive. You can go to explore and you just slide in. You have shopping, eating. You can actually customize the tabs. You can go to shopping. You can go to places where you can actually select which one. So again, this is playing together with HTML5. Then you can get this, you can actually change. So you see how all the components are being customized. Let's go to Bondi Beach. That's a nice one to go. So it's actually all nice together. You can actually go and see the weather. Again, for the weather, all this is being customized. So you actually create the coloring for these We're going to see more details about that. Or you can go ahead and change the city. For example, go to Melbourne, and then you would just change it to city and just, again, go through. So very simple UI, but I just want to get out of the box a little bit and create a different different application. And then the casino one. I didn't have enough time to put music into it. I think it would be really great to have music into this application. So you can play, for example, oh, I was playing with Simon. These things are not supposed to be here. But anyway, you see the idea of how you can actually do your bets, and have the house to deliver the card for you, have animations for doing that. And just applications. And the last one, we have just the roulette going on. So anyway, the points that I wanted to do is very unconventional applications that you can do, and JavaFX will be very handy. So first part, using CSS to configure, to change the look and feel of your application. So the whole idea is really create your custom scheme. We're going to see how to do that, creating your own styles. You can create your own definition, or you can override existing ones. Something that comes very handy when I was building this is the default one that is being used in JavaFX is Caspian. So what I normally do, I bring in the CSS file and just check it out. If I want to customize a component, exactly what you can actually customize, and just have that as a reference. I think it was great for me, at least for me, when I was creating this. CSS in JavaFX application is very similar to CSS in HTML. There are a few changes, and I'm actually going to point those out for you. It is based on CSS version 2.1 spec. That's the URL. And again, there's some additions for about the current version 3, and there are also some specific elements just to provide some JavaFX features. So there are some, even though they are very close, they are based on CSS for HTML. Just make sure that you understand there are some difference. And again, the entire look and feel of your application will change just by changing the CSS file that you're using, the style that you're using. Why we're using it? So it's a domain specific. It's actually really good to declare all visual effects. You really empower designers. You can just have the designers create that for you, and you just use it. So it's actually a good separation between designers and the programmers. It's a standard, so everybody works with the standards, and it's actually widely adopted. So how does it work? So we're going to create CSS styles, and the way it is going to work is these styles are going to be applied in the nodes of your scene graph. So remember that in JavaFX, all your UI is actually created in a scene graph. So the way the styles are applied to the node of that particular scene graph. Again, first they are going to be applied to the parents and then down to their children. So each node will have two different things. One thing is has the style class and also an ID. And we're going to see that you can actually create styles for both, depending on the style class or depending on the ID of the component. So you have different options. I will walk a little bit more about that. So create your own style sheet. Create your defaults or override the default ones. Create your own styles, and then put all that in a CSS file, and then have your application point to it. So how does it work? You have your JavaFX application. So very simple application. You have a stage. You have one label. You add the label to the stage, and you just show it, right? Very basic JavaFX. If you want to bring your CSS files into it, you just have to get the styles, Once you get the styles, you add the CSS files that you want, the style that you want to be used to the scene. What do you, and again, all that, so this slide, you can actually, if you're using JavaFX Scene Builder, you don't even need to write that slide. All you have to do, as I'm going to point it out, is reference what is the CSS files that you want to use, and the code will be generated for you. It will be included into the fxml file that gets generated by Scene Builder. So what you're going to do is you're going to define the styles, right? And how do you define the styles? You need to define how you're going to apply the styles, right? Who is going to be changed by these styles? So this is what we call the selector, right? So this is what we actually match with the node in the scene graph. So there are different possibilities. For example, where you're designing, you can set .label and then define your style. This will apply to any node that has a style class label. You can also do it by number and then the name, for example. This will actually reference all the nodes in the scene graph that has an ID as a title, right? So this is how you're going to apply the styles to your nodes. If you define a style that is with asterisk, it will apply to all the nodes. You can also have states. So for example, you can apply a particular style once the label is being hovered, right? So you can do things like that. This style will be applied whenever you hover on the label. You can actually have compound styles. So think about the checkbox also have a label inside. So how you're going to render, how you're going to style the label that is inside the checkbox. So this is how you actually select the node in your scene graph where your style is going to take place. And this is the syntax. So you have the rule, you have the selector that we were mentioning. In this case, the selector is label. And then you do have a pseudo class that is hover. And all you have inside is the definition of your style. So what you're saying is this particular rule will apply to anything that belongs or it is label type. So it comes from label. It's going to apply of font size of 18, font family, we're going to use Arial, the weight of the lines, and then the fill-in color. Okay, and we're going to see later on that we do have gradients, so you can actually have a nice effect, not just applying colors or stuff like that. For example, if you want to have a label that has the linear gradient, so this is actually what we're going to have in this case, from top to bottom, is turning from red to black, right? And then again, some font and font information for that label. So again, this will apply to all the labels that you have on your app UI, okay? This one, when you use by default, label will override the definition that we have for labels. So this is overriding all the labels. You might want to keep some of the labels with the predefined style, so you can do that. The thing that you need to do is when you create a style, just make sure you use a different name. So only the labels that has this particular style class associated to it will be modified. Okay, so one thing is overriding the default ones or creating your new styles. So in this one, you're creating a new one, and you do have to apply. So label down here, by default, won't pick up my label style because it will pick up the previous slide. It will pick up label one. So the way to add that particular style to your label will be either through this line, where you actually get the style class and add that style to it, or also doing on Scene Builder that I'm going to show you. So two different approaches. So Scene Builder, I just love it. So if you pay attention to the right-hand side, you have the whole section for CSS. If you select the anchor panel, that's where you actually associate the style sheet that you want to use, right? So this is where, rather than doing it in code, you can come to Scene Builder, you can keep the anchor panel, go to the CSS section and add the style sheet that you're going to be using through all your application. Okay? For a particular component, for example, the label, then you will go to the style class. Okay? So that's where you put, for example, this label is going to use my label, the one that we just created on the CSS. Notice also that you have access to the component ID. So remember, the rules are applied either by style class or by ID, and you do have access to all that through Scene Builder. This is just pretty much the same thing. So here you're just styling an H box, you're providing which style class you want. In this case, it's a dark panel. And to assign everything to your application, just make sure you take a name container. In this case, it's anchor panel by default. So just make sure at the anchor panel level, you specify the CSS files that you're going to be using. If you want to set the styles without having to create a CSS file, you can do so. So you can actually set the styles of your component directly in your code. I do not recommend it because you won't be reusing really styles among the components, but it's an option that you have if you just want to maybe customize one or two components. There's something you can think of. So what do we have different? So I think the most powerful things that we have is the idea of creating new colors from an existing ones. So we can derive a color from an existing one. We're going to see that. You can have a ladder, so there is a ladder function that think about like a gradient, and from that gradient you're going to pick a color between that line, right? It's not that you're creating a gradient, it's like you create a gradient, and from that, for example, remember the label, you create it from red to black. So you're creating the same spectrum, and what you're doing is you're picking a value between that, and you're creating a new color from that, line of colors that you have. So you can actually create new colors from existing one. Gradients, we have linear and radial. Multiple background fills, so this is actually very, very useful. When you are, for example, styling a button, you can actually have multiple layers of colors, so you can actually play and kind of create the effect of having borders or highlights, stuff like that. And I have a little bit more of that later on. Effects, again, really powerful. You have shadows and inner shadows. So this is a little bit more information about the different options that you have for creating, for example, new colors. So you can derive from a particular color, and you provide a percentage. That percentage could go from -100 to 100. So going to 100, you just go make the color going, and on the positive value, it will make your color lighter. If you go all the way to the end to 100, it will just return you white completely. And if you go to the other side, to the negative value, as you go, it will get darker all the way till you get 100%, -100%, which is actually return black. And we're going to see it's actually very, very useful when you're creating your style. One of the things that I like, I've seen it before, is you define one main color. For example, the screens that I want to do are going to be kind of blackish color, so I want to all be in the turn of blacks and grays, lighter and darker. So you define one color at the top, and everybody, all the definitions that you do can be actually depending on that, can be deriving from that, could be a gradient for that color. So you're gonna see how you can just change one color, and that will actually generate a complete new style for your application. So it's actually really powerful what you can do with these functions. Ladder, I pretty much explained it. So you just interpolate between colors, and so think about it like a gradient is created, but you actually get as a return one value, one color that is picked up from that line. So either 0 or 100, does depend where you step on that line, the kind of color, the color that you are actually getting. You have linear gradients and radial ones. I don't want to step too much into the details of the syntax, because I'm going to show a lot of code that has them being used. So the first one, you want to style a particular pan. So as I say, it's very important that you define for example, a master color in your root. The root is going to apply to everybody in the tree, right? So everybody will have access to the master color, okay? So by defining your gradient, depending on that color, make it very useful. Everybody depends on that color. If I change that to red, the entire interface will change, right? So we will be generating a new gradient based on red rather than black. So I think it's actually really powerful. Few things too. Notice when I'm playing with CSS, what I like to do is I want to exaggerate a little bit so I know exactly what's happening, right? Once I know that everything is correct, I put a normal. So for example, you can see that the background is very thick, but that was the only way to know, for example, that to set up a rounded corners for your panel, you need to set both the background radius and the border radius. So if you don't take both of them, so for example, if you don't put the background radius, you're going to see how it doesn't render how I want it. That was having, rounded corners, right? So I think it's very useful to have things like that. Just exaggerate or use different colors so you know exactly what is popping up. Border width. And another trick that I always do is I fill out the border with the opposite color that I do for the background. So for example, see that the background, I have a radial gradient that starts from light gray to darker. And I use the same color in the border, but the opposite. So I start with the darker one, I end up with the light one. But it does a contrast completely nicely during the whole shape, right? So you'll never have like two colors that are the same, so you kind of lose the border. So I think it's a good trick. You don't have to spend a lot of time on how to design things. Just get one color, apply it to the opposite to the border, and it kind of stand up a little bit. For multiple backgrounds, again, this is ugly, but it's really good to show you what is actually happening. So remember how you can have multiple backgrounds. So this is exactly what is happening. You apply multiple backgrounds. The first one is red, the second one is blue, then you apply the white one, and then you apply the green one, right? So what is happening is you're actually really doing a shadow with the first one, with the red. You're actually creating an outer border with the blue, you're creating an inner border with the white, and finally you're painting the background with the green. So you can really see what's going on by setting these, right? Of course, when you have the colors that you want, just put it to, normal coloring, take out all the, and just have a nice result. So for example, for the panel at the bottom of our presentations, again, I have a master color black, and if you just by changing the color to red dark red, you have the result on the bottom. Because all the new colors that I use in my style depend on that, using the function. They either derive, if you want to have the same one, or just a little bit lighter, just derive and use a particular value, etc. So again, see how the border colors is using 4 colors, so things like that. For example, again, a bit more of ideas here for your creating your CSS, your styles. So you have my panel, exactly what you want over there. Remember we mentioned we have shadows. So you can see how we have an effect that is the drop shadow and the values that you're going to have. So you can see here that at the bottom, your panel is using that style. See how it nicely has that particular shadow. Background color. So again, in this case, we have 3 colors. And the one in the middle is lighter, so it kind of stands out a little bit. And then be careful with the background radius. What I did is I did different radius for the background, so each color actually have a different radius, so they are kind of a little bit smaller, so you can really see the effect. So you can see the line, the white line, kind of has a spacing between the border and the line, so you actually really make your component pop up a little bit. So just mastering, so what we're seeing, you can do something like that. Again, this is all using the black, master color black, and just using the functions to just generate. You can customize labels, list, everything, tab, anything you can think of. With that, I'm going to pass it to Simon that is going to talk a little bit more. Then, okay, I have a beautiful CSS file. Now, how do I bring the animation, sort of the things that we saw?
Okay, so as Angela said, we talked a little bit about some of the other kinds of things that you can do in terms of making the UI more effective. And it's very interesting, certainly from my point of view, to look at the way things have gone in terms of design of user interfaces over sort of like the last few years. Because we've had a sort of big swing, we have a big swing, away from swing, we've had a big swing towards more graphical interfaces and more visually appealing interfaces is the way that I would describe them. And really that's been a lot about adding sort of different effects to things. And what we're now seeing is somewhat a swing away from that, back to more cleaner interfaces and trying to avoid overuse of the kinds of effects that there are. So if you look at something like the, what used to be called Metro, but I don't know what it's called now, interface, that's a much more clean interface. They've really gone away from using a lot of shadows and using a lot of visual type of effects on the components, and try to make it a cleaner looking interface. But there's still a great deal that you can do in terms of making visually appealing applications using different types of effects. So, so what we're looking at is how to take advantage of the things that you can do in terms of the facilities that you've got in the underlying operating system. So one of the things now is that, unlike in the good old days of sort of X11 and window managers, we now have the ability to actually say, okay, I want my application to be presented, but I don't want the window frame around it. So we can say, okay, make me a nice clean interface where I don't have the decoration of the window around it. And then we get a sort of just the application sitting on top of the desktop, and you get a cleaner look to it. The other thing with that is that by not having the decoration of the window manager around it, you're also not restrained in terms of it being a rectangular interface. So if you wanted to, you can make your interface any shape you like, because now you're not sticking it inside a rectangle. So that's one of the things that's an interesting thing that you can consider. And so in terms of JavaFX, basically, as I hope you already know, you're using a scene graph, and that scene graph is presented on a stage. So the way that we take care of the different aspects of that, what we're going to do is we say, in terms of the stage, we initialize the style as being transparent. And so we can say, okay, we can have a transparent style applied to that. We can set the fill to be null, so that can be making that clean as well. And you can say, okay, I don't want to have decoration on the window and things like that. So that's pretty easy in terms of just changing the look of the whole application itself. So the other things that you can do are to give more sort of feedback, if you like, around certain elements of the UI. So things that we've done, or Angela has done, in terms of the interface that we designed for the casino, was to have things like dynamic menus. Rather than having a menu stuck on the display, what happens is when you move the cursor down to the bottom of the display or to the side of the display, it moves in dynamically, and then you can select something and then it disappears again. So the good idea in terms of design for that is, of course, you're not taking up real estate all the time. So you can limit the visibility of your menu only to when it's actually required. And that's pretty easy in terms of saying, okay, we want to animate that. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment in terms of how you move things and so on. But the other things you can do are things like the buttons, and thinking carefully about what makes sense from a user's perspective to have them attracted to a button or understand which button is about to be pressed. So there's things like, as you move the mouse over a particular button, that button becomes brighter. So you can change the transparency of it to make it look more obvious. And that way, you can make it easier for the user of your application to understand, which button they're about to press. It's all little things in terms of trying to help the user see what things they're going to be using and how they're going to be using them. So you've got things like zoom in feature, so you could actually change the size of a button so it becomes more obvious. When you push a button, change the effect on it so it becomes obvious that that button has been pushed. Simple things like that. And then the classic reflection that we've seen so much, probably one of the biggest contributions that Apple have made in terms of user interfaces, is the fact that we now have a little reflection underneath everything, you know, in our display. So again, this is one of those things where you might want to consider is less more. Now, in terms of transparency, one of the great things about JavaFX is that every component that you have in your scene graph is a node. And every node has a set of properties associated with it, one of which is the opacity or the transparency of it. And so you can very easily say, well, I want this particular component to have a certain translucency to it. And we can set that value between 0 and 1 to say 0 means it's completely invisible, 1 means it's completely opaque, so you won't see anything underneath it. And then you can vary that between 0 and 1 to give you a different level of transparency. And because each node has a transparency or opacity property associated with it, that means that you can also apply that effect to a group of nodes at the same time. So if you've got your menu bar, which consists of a background, a number of different buttons, rather than having to go through and change the opacity of each individual component, you simply change the opacity of the group which contains all of those nodes, and that will automatically change all of them together. So simple things like that, just when we're creating something like a horizontal box layout manager, we can say, okay, we want the opacity of that to be 0.85, so there'll be a little bit of visibility of what's underneath. Similarly, in terms of how you can go about doing that, you can either do it explicitly in your code by setting a value in the node that you're actually doing, or you can use something like the scene builder, and that becomes very easy to set things like transparency, like reflection. So example here is that we've got a particular button, and so we've got the properties associated with that on the right-hand side. One of those you can say the effect you want to add is a reflection, so you add the reflection to your set of effects that you're using, and then that will have a certain number of properties associated with it as well. So you've got things like the top opacity, the bottom opacity, and various things like that. So you can change how big the reflection is and things like that. But all of that's very simple to do through the scene builder, and that will generate for you an fxml file which contains the information about what you're doing in terms of your user interface. So if you don't want to go through all the hassle of writing the code explicitly, you can use the scene builder, you can generate your fxml file and have that generated automatically and loaded up when you want to run it. Similarly, so this is again just kind of looking at the same programmatic idea, so we've really kind of covered that already, not really much point in going over that again. So let's talk a bit about animations. Animations are very, very useful in terms of user interfaces. And when we talk about animations, a lot of people misunderstand the idea. Animations often are associated with things like cartoons, where you've got something that changes over time, and it's an animation of a cartoon. So different frames give you the sense of movement. But that's not really what we're talking about in terms of animations with JavaFX. Yes, you could do those types of animations if you want to, but most of what we're talking about in terms of animations with JavaFX is something where you're changing a property of one of the nodes in, or more than one node in your scene graph over time. So that's what we mean by an animation. It's where you're changing something over time. And if you go to the Ensemble sample demonstration application that you can get from the JavaFX website, there's lots of examples of various animations in there. So let's talk a little bit about some of the concepts involved in an animation. If you want to animate something, you're going to use a timeline. And what this effectively is the definition of a period of time in terms of your application. So you might want to animate the change of the opacity in a particular button. So you want to change it as you move the mouse over the button. Rather than having it change instantly, you want it to fade in or fade out. And that requires a certain amount of time for the opacity to change. Now, in the old days, typically what you do is you would write yourself a loop, and then you would just change the value of the opacity in that loop, maybe put a pause in it and do things like that. Well, you can't really do that in JavaFX. I mean, actually, that's not speaking true. You can do that in JavaFX, but it becomes more complicated because you have issues around the fact that JavaFX, like Swing, uses a single threaded model, and if you start putting a loop in the event, effectively the event dispatch thread, or the application thread, I should say, for JavaFX, it ties up the redrawing of the screen and you get all sorts of problems because it doesn't look right. So you don't want to be doing things on the application thread in terms of using a loop. So you need a timeline. A timeline is designed to work with the application thread in terms of not blocking redrawing the screen and updates to the display. So you create a timeline, and the timeline is going to consist of a number of key frames. And these key frames are where you want certain things to happen or certain values to be at a specific value. So I should say certain properties to have a specific value at a particular point in time. And that way you can define as many keyframes as you want. So if you want to have lots of different things changing over a period of time, you can, and have lots of different points in time. And then for each of those key frames, you have one or more key values. And the key values are the properties that you're going to modify over the time that the timeline is running. And that way you can specify, okay, if I want to change the opacity, here's the starting value that I want, here's the end value that I want. Those are your key values. You create a keyframe or keyframes for that containing those values, and then when you run the timeline will vary the value that you put into your key value between the values that you specify. And it will handle all of the necessary looping, if you like, and the variation in that property. And then the way that that happens can be changed as well. So you can have different interpolators being used for how the values change. So you can use just a straight linear interpolator where you vary the value simply in a linear fashion. If you plot time against value, it'll just be a straight line. But you can also use some nice effects which are called ease in and ease out. And what that does is it sort of accelerates a little bit at the beginning, then it uses a linear change, and then it decelerates at the end. So if you're doing some sort of movement, that often can be very useful because it gives a nicer effect to the way things look. It's not just a straight change, it can actually sort of start accelerating and then decelerate at the end. So essentially, you've got three different things that you're concerned with in terms of animations. There's your timeline, which is the thing that's going to actually do the variation on the properties. You've got your key frames, which are the specific points in time where you want things to be true. And then you've got your key values, which are the properties that you're actually going to change. So I should really change the point size on this. It's a little bit small, and I do apologise for that. But essentially what we're doing here is looking at how we can move a circle from the left to the right on the display. So we've got a little blue circle, we want to move it left to right. And what we actually want to happen is for that to move from left to right and then right to left back again. So we want it to sort of bounce back and forth. We want it to carry on for as long as the application is running. So what we do is we create a circle and we set whatever properties we want on that in terms of lighting and colour and so on. And then we need the property that is going to represent the thing that we want to change. In this case, we're looking at the translate in the x-axis property, so where we translate on the x-axis. So we can retrieve that from the circle, and that's a double property, so double value property. The timeline is going to use that, and we're effectively binding the property that we have to the values that are going to be changed. And so what we do is we create a timeline, which we'll call move timeline, and that's going to have two key frames in it. One key frame is going to be at time 0 seconds. So that'll be at the start of the timeline. And that's going to have a key value, which uses the x position, which is our property of our circle in terms of translation on the x-axis. And we set that to 0. So that'll be where it starts from. Then we have another key frame with a key value that uses the same property, xpos, because we want to vary the position on the x-axis. And that's going to change to a value of 205. And the time associated with that is going to be a duration of 4,000 milliseconds, which is 4 seconds. When we run the timeline, in fact, before we run the timeline, we set the cycle count to be timeline indefinite. So that means it will just continue either until the user stops the application or the universe achieves thermal equilibrium, whichever happens first. And then you can also set auto-reverse to be true, which means that when you run the timeline, it gets to 4 seconds, the value of xpos has become 205. When it runs the next iteration of the timeline, it will go from 205 back to 0, which is what we want. So we want to reverse the direction that we're moving in. So you can set that by setting auto-reverse. And then when we play that, the timeline will actually vary the value of xpos between 0 and 205 over 4 seconds. Because it's a property of the circle will automatically be redrawn in the correct position. Another example of using a timeline, again I should increase the point size on this, I do apologise. What you can also do is, in addition to having a key value associated with your key frame, you can also say, I want to have some action happen. So it's not just about changing values, it's also about saying, well, I want something specific to happen at that particular time. And so you can define an event handler, and that will have a method in it, which is handle, and that is what can be called at a specific point on your timeline. So a very typical use of that is that you vary the position of your circle, and then at the end of the timeline, you want something to happen. Now, with a timeline, timeline's asynchronous. And that means that when you call play on your timeline, it returns immediately. So you can't say, okay, well, I'll call play and then I'll wait until the animation's finished, because the animation, the timeline will automatically return straight away. So you need some way of knowing when the timeline is actually finished. So what you typically do is you say, in the last key frame of my timeline, I'll add an event handler so that I can then have a method that will call something or do something, which is what I want to happen at the end of the animation. So that's how you typically use an event handler. But you don't have to use it in that way. You can put it anywhere in the timeline itself. So there's lots of possibilities that you can do there. One of the other things that we've done in JavaFX is we understand that there are a number of typical kinds of uses of timelines, and these are transitions. So what we've done here is to provide a set of, in effect, pre-packaged timelines. So you have a number of transitions that can do things like fade, so you can change the opacity. You don't have to get the opacity of a particular object. You can just have the transition work with the node itself. You can do things like a path, and you can define a path over which your node is going to move and have the timeline or the transition handle that automatically for you. You can do things like rotations, you can do scaling, you can do translations in terms of moving. And all of these are very flexible in terms of the various values that you can specify for them. So you can say, okay, I want the opacity to vary between 0.25 and 0.75 rather than between 0 and 1. The other thing you can do is you can put these together. So if you want to have a number of different transitions happen on your nodes, you can do them either in parallel or sequentially. So if you want to have like a fade and a scale happen at the same time, you have two transitions happen in parallel. Once those are finished, you can then have a translation that moves the button somewhere else, and that can happen sequentially. So it happens when the first two that are running in parallel have actually completed. So you can nest them, you can do that arbitrarily, you've got complete flexibility on how you use these. And then because the transitions and the timelines, transition is in effect a subclass of timeline almost, then you can also include a timeline in with your transitions. So you could have a transition and a timeline that does something strange, have those happen in parallel. Once that's completed, you can have another timeline happen sequentially. So there's lots of ways of mixing things together. This is just an example of how we could use a translation. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm using the transition builder to create a new transition for my circle, and I'm saying that the duration of that's going to be 4 seconds. I'm specifying the start and the end point of the x-axis being 20 and 380. Timeline's indefinite, a cycle count is indefinite, auto-reverse is true. So that's going to do the same thing as I did with my timeline, except I don't have to create all the keyframes and the key values and so on. I can just simply set up the values that I want to have on that transition, and it's a lot simpler than doing all of the hard work with the timeline. Just a simple example here of how we can use a parallel transition. What we want to do is we want to have a number of transitions happen on the same node. In this case, I want to be able to fade, translate, rotate, and scale. Probably a little bit over the top on a particular component, but it's an example. So we have 4 different transitions that are going to happen on the same node. And what we do here is we say, okay, create a parallel transition with all of those transitions involved in it, and it will run all of them at the same time. Again, you don't have to create all the timelines, you don't have to deal with all the complexities of that. It happens automatically underneath. And then again, you can set the cycle count, and then you just play that parallel transition. How we can use that in terms of the user interface that Angela developed for our casino is if we want to have our menu slide in and slide out. So when we move the mouse to the edge of the screen, we want to have the menu slide in. When we move the mouse away, we want to have it slide out. So we can create an animation where we're doing a translation transition. We'll change the Y value so we can move it off the edge of the screen. JavaFX doesn't care where you put things. It's quite happy to put things way off the screen if you want to. Less work for JavaFX, so it doesn't have to render them. And then what we can do in terms of showing a particular, or showing the menu, is we set the rate to be 1 to indicate that the rate is positive. So it will move in a particular direction, and then we play that. And then we want to move it back. This is almost like the auto reverse. We set the rate to be -1 to indicate that it's going in the opposite direction. And so that will then play the same animation. We don't have to use a different timeline, we can use the same one, but it will move the menu bar away from the screen rather than onto the screen. One of the nice things with Scene Builder is that it allows you to construct paths to be used in a transition. So if you want a path transition and you want a fairly complex path involved, in this case we want to be able to move a card from the deck onto a particular player's spot on the table. Rather than having it just go in a straight line, we can create some nice smooth curves to give it that interesting look and feel and make it look like a better, more costly application. And so we can use the Scene Builder to do that, and we can actually specify a path, and the Scene Builder will calculate what necessary components are required in terms of creating that path so that we can then create the transition. Doing for time? Not too well. Okay, very quickly then, lots and lots of animations involved in this. So we've got, because we're going to show this, aren't we?
We already showed it at the beginning.
So you've seen there's lots of animations involved in this, so I won't go into that in too much detail. Yeah, so these are basically the things that I've already talked about. So you've got the idea of path transition, you've got the idea of rotate transitions. So as you move a card, you want it to move along a particular path to the table, but then you also need to be able to rotate it so it fits in the right place for the player. So there's a path rotation and path transition and a rotate transition involved for moving a card. And then you've also got the idea of a fade transition, because what we do is we have the card, in order to turn the card over, you simply have both sides of the card displayed at the same time, and you set the opacity of the back of the card either to be 1, so you're seeing the back of the card, or 0, and then you see the front of the card. So you fade that in to give the effect of it turning over. And then, yeah, sequential transition, that's just the idea of how we link the different parts together. So you have the path transition to move it to the right place. You've got the rotate transition, which could be in parallel or could be at the end. And then you've got the fade transition, which happens after you've moved the card to the correct place on the table. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Angela, who's got 5 minutes.
That's perfect. So again, building this application, I kind of thought, normally you're going to have more than one screen. How do I transition between screens, and what is the best way to do it? If you think about the Scene Builder, how many of you have ever played with the Scene Builder? Okay, quite a, okay, so a lot of you, I'm impressed. So for those of you who are not very familiar, what Scene Builder is going to do, once you start dragging and dropping the components, it's actually going to generate a file that is called fxml. And that file is actually used by your application, loaded by your application and rendered. So instead of having to write Java code to place buttons, tables, and stuff like that, you can use Scene Builder, just drag and drop components, have the tool generate the FXML for you, and all you have to do on the Java side is load that using an FXML loader. So it actually generates the scene graph for you using that file. It's really good, but then when you end up, for example, creating the casino application, is I have multiple screens. For each screen, I'm going to have FXML file. And each FXML file normally has a controller that is in charge of loading that. We're actually injecting the components into your code and then using it. So what happens when I have multiple screens? I end up having multiple FXML files and multiple controllers. And you might say, okay, it's no big deal, just load everything onto your scene graph. Maybe not a very good idea. Maybe there are performance issues. So the bigger your scene graph gets, you're going to have impact in your performance. So you don't want to load the screens that you are not seeing. So, you know, a few things start playing there, and that's how I come up with two different approaches. So the first one is, the first application was very small. I only want to have, it was originally targeted to be small, so I wasn't using many resources. So I thought, you know what, let's play with something that is called the viewport. So this is actually something that is not new. It's being used especially for game development. What you have is you have your entire screen design, and you just have a little window that you see through it. So you're only seeing that window. The good thing about the C-port is you can actually set up different shapes. So you can see through stars, through a square area. You can actually define your viewport. And all you have to do is you have your window, and you can actually bind the X and Y property of your window to a particular property. So by updating that property, you can actually move your window down or up or side to side. So we're using very important things in JavaFX, like binding functionality. As you bind, as you are watching a particular property, as that property changes, you're going to be updated. So that's all I'm doing. I have my entire screen design, I have a viewport, and all I'm doing is changing the location of that. So it's actually handy if you want to think about big applications with a lot of components. Might not a very good idea, right? But for this case, I think it actually worked pretty well, and especially if you have a flat scene graph, it's actually a good solution. Again, it's something well known in game development. For the second application instead, each screen has many components. If you think about the games, each chip that you have for playing is a component. The cars, so you have a card decks. Some casinos even have 8 card decks at the same time. So there is a lot of UI components in one single screen. So putting all those in the scene graph was not a very good idea. So the scene graph tried to make it as flat as possible. Scene Builder is generating one FXML file per screen. So this is what you have visually. So you have your scene graph that has a root, and you might have different components for each screen. Again, if you use Scene Builder, you will have FXML file plus a controller. So I ended up kind of creating my own framework for unloading and loading the screens. So what I did is all of them has a common background, so I just left the background there, and I just have a screen controller that actually loads the particular screen at a given time. So the screen controller is very simple, has an add screen, load a screen, or unload a screen. And all the screens that were generated from Scene Builder actually inherit from a managed screen interface that I create. So just make sure the screens have a common interface, common type, so they can be just loaded and unloaded by the screen controller. So that way, anytime we move from a screen to a screen, you just load the screen that you need and just download the previous one. With that, I think we're pretty much out of time. Again, I just want to briefly show you a little bit Scene Builder for those of you who are not familiar with it. So one good thing about some exception right there, when you create your application, you can actually create an application. You have different options for JavaFX application. My machine is kind of not working properly.
We're pretty much out of time, by the way.
Okay, anyway, yes.
On that note.
I think it's time to finish. So anyway, I do encourage you, if you haven't tried the scene builder, the latest release, it's actually really powerful. Creating user interfaces, again, most of the time, at least for me, was creating the components, the images, and what you're going to do. Because rendering and putting things together with those tools is actually pretty easy. With that, I want to thank you very much.